here, and I'll hand it off to you, Mr. Earl.
Yeah, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Audrey, for that nice introduction. Great to be with all of you. And I think, Gil, you've got some slides that you're gonna put up. Terrific.
Yeah. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then if I move it, can you see that as well?
Yep.
All right, we're all good to go.
Okay, so let's advance the slide. I wanted to start out this afternoon. First of all, thank you for joining us. I know that everybody is zoomed out. We've got, a lot of us spending a lot of time online staring at screens. We want to make this as conversational as possible, and that's why I asked Dirk to join me this afternoon, so that it's not just me talking at you, but that we do have something of a conversation. Before we get to that conversation, I just wanted to sort of set the table for the scope of the problem that we're dealing with, and some ideas for how we might be able to improve as a society on the way that we deal with individuals who have been convicted of crimes and incarcerated. So it's important to get some of these basic facts down. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than any nation in the world. There are currently nearly 2.2 million people in prison and in jail. About 77 million Americans, extraordinary figure, has a criminal record. That's from the National Conference of State Legislatures. 1 in 5 people in prison are incarcerated for a drug-related offense. About 600,000 people a year return home from prison, and recidivism rates for those individuals remain extraordinarily high. About 2/3 of individuals who are released from prison in any given year will be rearrested for a new crime within a year or two after their release. A 2018 Bureau of Justice Statistics report found that 68,000 people were released from state prison in 2005, and found that 83%, roughly equivalent to 5 out of 6, were arrested again within 9 years of their release. Why don't we go ahead and advance that slide, Gil? Okay, so prison culture. I think it almost goes without saying, but we'll say it anyway, that the social and physical environments of our nation's prisons and jails is not conducive to successful rehabilitation. Association with antisocial peers is considered to be a major contributing factor to whether someone recidivates. I would say it's also a major factor in whether they are engaged in a crime to begin with, and that pro-social peers and interactions lead to higher rates of desistance, and desistance defined as, I've committed a crime, I've gone to prison, I've been released, but there's been some sort of shift in my life where I am no longer prone to commit any further crimes. So these pro-social peers and interactions are one of the most effective ways we have to foster that. Incarceration is often considered to be a high stressor in someone's life, and results in both negative effects on physical and mental health. So this is one of the perverse aspects of incarceration, is that we take people who often, not always, but very often, have suffered from a high degree of trauma, which led to their to the commission of crime. And then we put them into an environment in which we continue to re-traumatize them. Um, and yet somehow we're surprised that when people get to the end of their sentences, that they come out and commit more crimes. It doesn't make sense actually that they wouldn't if there is not only nothing positive happening, but additional kind of negative interactions, negative conditions that reinforce the old habits. Despite this, we know that only about 30% of inmates participate in any kind of rehabilitative programming. Now that's astonishing, at least it's astonishing to me, that we've got over 2 million people behind bars and only about a third of them are doing anything. That doesn't mean that what they're doing is effective, but that only 30% of prisoners are engaged in any kind of rehabilitative programming behind bars. So education, this is, we're getting close to our conversation now with Dirk and his work, but education is a powerful catalyst for change. But our approach to prison education is often very one-dimensional. There's a strong bias toward training in skilled trades. Become an electrician, become a carpenter, become a plumber, become something, an occupation working with your hands. That's what the emphasis tends to be on. But many in prison have neither interest nor skill for work in the trades. And this is it's almost as if we're operating on a kind of stereotype of the kind of person who is behind bars as someone who could only do that. It says something about both what we think about the trades and also what we think about people who wind up in prison, as if trades are for people who are unable to do anything else, when in fact, people in the trades are often among the most skilled workers. So trade education doesn't address some of the leading causes and or factors that play into criminal behavior: illiteracy and socialization challenges. So is there a role, we're asking the question today, is there a role for bachelor level and liberal arts education in prison? We know that people who take part in education in prison have substantially less, are substantially less likely to recidivate. Now, we don't know whether that's a function of the education or the type of person who takes advantage of the education, but there's definitely a correlation between participating in education and staying out of jail. So despite these advantages, few inmates have access to quality, non-technical education while they're incarcerated. And this grows out of a provision in the 1994 crime bill that has been talked about a lot in the last 6 months. It was passed by Congress, signed into law by President Clinton, which cut off access to federal Pell Grants for prisoners. There's something odd going on in this. It doesn't really serve our interest as a society not to invest in educational programs, given what we know about how they impact criminal behavior. But what it does do, what that policy does do, is it appeals at some level to our instinct to punish wrongdoing. And this usually gets expressed in something like, you're telling me that I, as a taxpayer, should pay to educate people who have committed crimes when I can't afford to send my own kids to school, or I'm having to pay for out-of-pocket education for my own children. Why should somebody behind bars have that kind of public support? They've committed a crime. And they need to pay for it and not be coddled. The problem with that is that when we take that stance, we're mostly hurting ourselves through the costs of maintaining inmates as they move through this revolving door of crime and recidivism. I think this is gradually beginning to dawn on both policymakers and on the public, that this may be a counterproductive way of looking at this challenge. Both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have been funding Pell Grant pilot programs that will hopefully pave the way for a more permanent solution. So right now, if you happen to be in a prison where an organization has received a federal grant under this pilot program to provide Pell Grants, you may be able to go to prison, but it's a tiny program, nothing like that which would be able to serve a significant portion of the nation's incarcerated population. So we have with us today for the rest of this conversation, Dirk Van Velzen, who is the founder and CEO of the Prison Scholars Fund, which helps support prison education at the bachelor degree level for people who are behind bars. He himself served, Dirk, was it 14 years?
We'll have it down to, oh, there you go. I think it's about 15.
15.
Some people have it down to the day and the hour. I didn't really do that. But yes, 14 or 15, just round it off. It's okay.
Okay. So we'll round it off at 15 years in prison. And while he was incarcerated, he earned an Associate's in Science. That's an AS, right?
That's right.
Yeah, Associate's in Science in Business Administration and a BS in Organizational Leadership from Penn State University. So post-incarceration, he earned a certificate in nonprofit management from the University of Washington and had a spot with the Stanford Graduate School of Business and its executive program in social entrepreneurship. So here's someone who's really seen this whole journey and understands the role of and importance of education. Dirk and I have been talking to one another for 2 years now, just about his work and his experience. We had, not this summer when nobody was traveling, obviously, but the previous summer, I had a family vacation out in the Seattle area where Dirk lives, and had the privilege of going down to spend a couple hours with him, where we recorded a really long and interesting podcast, which you can get on Dirk's website, that we're going to try to recapture, or on the PSF website, I should say. But we're going to try to recapture some of that conversation that we had in his offices in Seattle for this conversation. And I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit, before I start asking a whole bunch of questions of him, just to give us the 10 minutes on Dirk. You know, where's Dirk from? What happened to Dirk? What did Dirk do? And his journey from being in prison, having committed crimes and being in prison, to someone who now is working hard every day to help other people escape that situation, that cycle, and to restart their lives. So Dirk, talk a little bit about your journey and what happened to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks so much for having me, Brent, and the introduction, Audrey, and Gil for all the support. And it's nice to meet all of you. Thank you for tuning in and listening. I guess I could start with my journey to prison in the first place. I didn't really have any structural problems. I came from a good family, good neighborhood. I just made bad decisions. And I think my bad decisions kind of started small. And over time, they just got bigger and bigger until I was committing crimes for probably a decade before I got to prison. And I was a commercial burglar, which just means breaking into businesses and warehouses as opposed to houses. So they finally got me. And I did about 15 years in prison for a whole string of commercial burglaries that they caught me for. And, some other things mixed in there too. I was, kind of running crazy for a while. and it really just, there's no one to blame for all that, but for myself. But as I mentioned, I came from a pretty decent family, so kind of college had always been something important to the family. And I just never took it very seriously. I tried to go to school on the streets, just didn't really do very well. So when I finally got to prison, I heard people talking about you could do these college programs. So I was really excited about that because I heard about this in the county jail, which is, if you know how the system works, you're in the county jail when you're being sentenced, then you get to prison. So by the time I got to prison in about 2000, I was really kind of geared up to take these college classes to like do something with my time. Then I found out the Pell Grant was taken away in '94 during the war on drugs. And kind of the idea back then was Congress wanted to enact these measures to be tough on crime, but they kind of conflated being tough on criminals with being tough on crime. They figured that being tough on crime would mean taking away opportunities for prisoners while incarcerated, including education. Like in some worlds, the prisoners are making a mental evaluation that maybe I shouldn't go to prison because there's not college classes there. You know, they don't really do that math. They just, however they get to prison, how they get there. And once they're in prison, you should have programs where they can rehabilitate. So once the Pell Grant was taken away, I think about 350 college prison programs in America dropped down to less than 10. And as Brent mentioned, only 30% of prisoners are doing anything rehabilitative. And that kind of, a little context of that is the prisoners aren't just sitting around mainly. Everyone generally has to have a job. So pretty much everyone is working either support services or kind of running the prison, you know, janitorial, cooking, cleaning, admin work. And they get paid anywhere from like 3 to 20 cents an hour for support services. And the ones that end up in industries is kind of like a trades. Like the privileged people in prison can work in a factory where they can make textiles and furniture and things like that. And every state has different laws about public-private partnerships. So the whole kind of view of the prison industrial complex is prisons couldn't exist if you had to hire people to run the prisons. But if you can, you know, pay the prisoners basically slave labor, which comes down to, I think, the Eighth Amendment issue, which is slave labor is not allowed in America except in prisons. So if that little amendment got fixed, then you can have basically slaves working for slave labor in a prison, which means you would have to hire people at market paid wages, which you really couldn't do. We would have probably not 2.2 million people in America if we had to actually pay for that. So coming back down to the whole overview of prison, is this really less of a rehabilitation environment and more of just a work environment for the prisoners to keep the prisons running. And the guards' role is really just oversight and making sure people are not escaping or killing each other. And of course, once that Pell Grant got taken away, all those programs really disappeared. So then, you know, then I come along to prison wanting to do this Pell Grant, and I found out it's not there. So that, you know, that kind of sucks for me. And it, you know, I wrote, I think it's 300 letters to churches and charities trying to get some kind of support for my tuition, 300 letters to businesses in my local community. Basically, nobody would even respond to me except the Mormons. They just sent me a nice letter saying, thanks for your letter, but we only support religious education. But that didn't really stop me. So I kind of kept working on my dad, and I finally got my dad after a couple of years to fund my education. And then I was so thankful that he would pay for it that I really wanted to pay him back with really good grades. So I kind of got straight A's all the way through. I got 1 A-. So I wanted to work really hard with this really rare opportunity I had. And that's kind of how the Prison Scholar Fund came into existence, because I was one of the very, very few people in a prison of 1,000 people going to school. And people would see me studying in the day room, they would see me going to school, and they would see me with all this interest in education. And the common thread I would hear over and over and over was, oh man, I would do the same thing. And when you hear this, and that's the other thing about prison you kind of notice when you get there is, a lot of people have this conception of what prison is, because we watch the movies, we see all these terrible stories. And of course, prison is an environment where some of that stuff happens, but overall, when you get to prison, it's just regular people that commit some kind of crime. And it turns out they're people just like you meet in society. They're actually good people. So you find out, hey, all these people that made a mistake, they're all stuck in the same box as I am. And a lot of them really want to change their lives, but they don't have a dad with a checkbook. The Pell Grant isn't available. Because I guess because I have a lot of energy and some empathy, I started the Prison Scholar Fund, having no idea how to run a nonprofit, but we just kind of made it work. We wrote a bunch of grants, raised 65 grand from prison, which is like $1 million. supported 110 people before I got released in 2015. And then, of course, when I got out of prison, I kind of just fell in love with everything we were doing. And you know, running a nonprofit is probably not the smartest thing to do, because especially in the prison reform space, it's, if it was kitty cats and firefighters, I'd have a better nonprofit, but raising money for prisoners is kind of hard. But the impact is amazing when you see people that really turn their lives around, and you know, they're definitely thankful. So, and this comes back down to kind of the data set that Brent was talking about. Like the data from the Vera Institute, they say that the odds of coming back to prison decreased by 43% through correctional education. So I went and talked to the lady that wrote that study, and it turns out it's kind of a black box on what works in correctional education. They know that the broad scope of this data, but they don't know how education affects different crime types, what type of education is needed, what the best delivery method, like the best courses of study. So there's all these random variables that you don't really know what really works. And that also comes back to what Brent was saying. There's kind of this paternalistic view of trades, like all these prisoners are stupid, so they should be doing construction work. But you know, construction work is also difficult work. You know, there's framing, which is a little bit less challenging than maybe aerospace machining. But they have, you know, the prison administrators kind of think that all the prison people should just be digging ditches and framing houses. So vocational is kind of, it's there, you can do that. But you know, you really need to figure out what's the aptitude of the people in prison, just like the military has those aptitude tests to figure out where to stick people. You need to figure out what the people's interests are and their vocations are. You know, post-secondary isn't for everybody. Probably maybe 15 to 20% of those incarcerated, or that's a good path for them. The other people, we can figure out what to do with what they want to do. And of course, there's probably, you know, 5 or 10% that are just incorrigible. So, you know, we got to figure out what to do with them. But there should be enough opportunities that basically have a payoff at the end. And education, post-secondary education, has a great return on investment. The Washington State Institute for Public Policy shows that $1 invested in correctional education returns $19.80 back to society. And that $19.80 is kind of a conservative value, because they look at avoided costs, policing costs, criminal justice costs, victim costs, policing costs, and future prison construction and incarceration costs. So those are all the costs you can avoid if somebody does commit a crime and come back to prison. The costs they don't calculate are what's the value of someone getting a job, paying taxes. And the things that are harder to measure is maybe that person is a first-time college student. Maybe he gets, you know, or he might even be a college student while he's currently incarcerated, but he also might have sons and daughters and uncles and cousins. And if they can see their dad going to school in prison, then that might touch other people in the community, and you can have other people going to prison based on this one person going to, other people going to college, then they might not have before. So it's kind of harder to measure the positive value of people going to prison, but I'm sure you could probably, somebody's probably done that. And I think that's kind of the 10-minute overview. So I'll turn it back over to Brett and have a conversation.
Okay. This is great. So you all just heard a very truncated version of the Dirk Van Velzen story, which is even more interesting and compelling than what you've heard. So I want to get into some of that. And I want us to focus a little bit, Dirk, on you were on this spree for 10 years, you know, committing a lot of crime, and they finally got you, and then you went to jail, and you told me a really interesting story about those first couple of years in jail. I don't know if you remember this, but sort of
it'll come back to me.
About kind of the psychological process that you went through in beginning to kind of wake up from, or maybe that's not the right word, but kind of tuning into what you had actually done. Do you remember the story? Do I need to give you more hints?
I could probably run with that, but if you want to give me another hint, that'd be great. I think
okay,
I know
so
where you're going.
Okay, so you talked to me about how for the first year or so you kind of reran your arrest and how you got
Sure.
caught. And so that's the story I'm talking about.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, for sure. So,
Yeah.
and this, I don't know if I actually unpacked it this much with Brent, but for example, when I first got caught, I had charges in Washington State that were still pending. So, long story short, I was a commercial burglar in Washington, and there's a multi-jurisdictional task force after me. I saw them following me, so I fled the state. Then I went to California, committed a bunch of crimes in California, and that's where they caught me. So I got a 10-year sentence in California, which means I had to do 5 years of the 10 years because you get good time. And as I was doing my 5 years, I also had all of these charges pending from Washington, and I got kind of a list of all the charges they had against me. And I was looking at these charges, I was like, no way they can catch me for these things, because a lot of those charges, they either have to catch you on the site or catch you with the property, some kind of evidence. When I left, I just left, and they didn't catch me with anything. So like, there's no way they can catch me for this stuff. So worst case scenario, all that stuff's gonna go away because they can't prove it. And I'll just do my 5 years in California, and I'll just be back on the streets. So the way I viewed it was, my problem with how I got to prison was basically I had a crime partner, and he got caught, and he kind of fingered me. And but actually, even though he was my crime partner, him and I had a lot of trust over these years of working, so I never believed he would tell on me. So I believed that he would not be the weak link in the Dirk and Rico chain. It would just be there's this lack of evidence. And then my cellie in California was telling me, that guy probably told on you. I was like, no way, you don't know Rico. Rico would never tell on me. So I figured I'd stay for the California crimes. I was new 5 years in California. And I figured after the 5 years in California that I could just go back out. I could keep on committing crimes because I was pretty good. They couldn't catch me. And I just figured the best way to do it is just not have a crime partner. So I was just kind of figuring out how to be a better criminal. And just kind of tuning up my game. So I had done it for 10 years. I was pretty proficient at being a burglar. And then of course, when I finally get back to Washington, then the other part of that is when you have charges pending in a different state, they don't have to come and get you unless you do this kind of court junction. You have to file a motion. So otherwise, what would happen is after my California time elapses, then they take me to Washington and I get sentenced. But I wanted to be sentenced while I was doing time in California because the sentences would start ticking in both states. I could burn a lot of time off. So I file a motion, I get hauled up to Washington to face my charges. And it turns out of the 25 of those charges, 24 of them were based on Rico's testimony. So sure enough, Rico did tell on me, and he got 1 year, I got 25, which boils down to 12 with good time. So then I go back to California, had to tell my cellie, you were right, Rico told on me. And still, I was still kind of like, okay, that just underlined my notion of not having a crime partner in the future. But I still really hadn't figured out, maybe I should just do something different, which is, not committing crimes. And then.
So the way you, Dirk, the way you described this to me was it was like this movie that you kept rerunning in your head. How could I have avoided getting caught? And that was sort of the story you were telling yourself. And then after a year or two, it was like, wait a second. How did I get here in the first place?
Yeah, that part of it. And that part of it too is once I kind of figured out this was a wrong path for me, then I kind of had a whole bunch of self-analysis. So the terrible thing about prison, and also the good thing about prison, is you have all this time to think. If you ever think about having an entire day or a month or a year just by yourself to think, that never happens. But when you're in prison, it does, if you're not watching TV. So if you're just thinking about things, you're like, how the hell did I get here? So this isn't so great. So once you start rewinding the clock, you rewind it to the moment of arrest. It's like, if I did something different, I wouldn't have gotten arrested. And then you kind of rewind it maybe a year before that. And finally, you start rewinding it so far, you're like, what should I have done not to get arrested? What should I have done not to commit the crime? Oh my God, how far back do I have to rewind this clock to figure out where did I go wrong? And then you realize you never stop rewinding the clock, because you're going to go back to high school, then to junior high. Then you think in 5th grade, if I did this, it's like you can never just undo history. So,
right. So this is a really important point, and it goes to kind of the work that I've been looking at in terms of fostering desistance among people who are in prison. How do you foster that? And getting people to take that journey back to that chain of causation, and then I think one of the things that does is that it also creates the opportunity to think about a different future, as well as what could I have done differently in the past? Well, what can I do differently in the future? And that's when we talked, that was where I really got the sense that that's where you said to yourself, I think education would have made a difference if I had stayed with college. Maybe this wouldn't have happened. And that's what kind of turned you toward pursuing education. At least that's my memory of what we talked about.
That's pretty close. And that's the whole thing. It's like when you have these journeys, you can't lie to yourself. I mean, you can, but you probably know you're lying. So when you go back to these like pivotal points, you have to be real with yourself. It's like, if I had done this, this is a path I probably would have been on. It's like, and when you think about it, when you're 30 years old or 40 years old, you're like, oh, shit balls. If at the age of 20, I chose this path instead of this petty criminal lifestyle, things would be a whole lot different. So, and part of that is like, it really builds in accountability. It's like, you have to own these decisions you made, and that's the decision you made, and that's the one you're rolling with. So once you start rewinding this clock, it's an interesting mental exercise. But now you're back to the future, which is, this is where I am now. I'm in prison right now. I need to do something. Education is probably where I should pick this back up.
Right.
And
But let's dwell on that point for just a second. I mean, the way that you're describing it, it sounds to me like education is the effect, right? The decision to go in to pursue education is an effect of another thing that happened inside your head of, I want something different. So education itself by itself isn't necessarily a change agent, or at least a motivation for change, so much as I am motivated to change, and this is the pathway that I'm choosing.
I'll say maybe to that, because it was kind of interesting, because I just kind of picked up the education thread because I was in prison. I was kind of bored. I had nothing to do. So I was like, well, I might as well do this college thing, because it seems like people are doing that are successful. And at first it was just kind of a motion I was going through. But then once I got good with school, I kind of never looked back. It's like, once you start getting good at it, then you get better and better. And then you really get turned on to it. And then so it's like, I think I got more excited about education the more I did and the better I did, which was probably way more excited than I ever would have thought I would have been when I first started it, which was really just a way to pass the time, and maybe I should get that college degree thing.
So I'm curious, I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about the desistance process, and and that's very interesting, kind of like unpacking that a little bit to say, this is a virtuous cycle, right? It's not an on and off switch. It's like you start to learn, and then you desire more learning, and you desire more learning, and it kind of grows and grows inside you. What do you think? How can we help people who are in prison begin that journey?
And this comes back to what you said about the pro-social environment. That is so important, because in my case, I wouldn't say I was on the fence about education. It was kind of, I knew that's probably what I should do with my time. But a lot of people, they don't have that family structure. They don't have an educational expectation. They've never been exposed to college before. So I think there's a lot of people in prison that they never knew college was an option. And so they're not really driven or motivated or drawn towards this college thing. But if in prison there were an environment where there's like a pod where you have all the college students, maybe a pod where you have all the vocational people, so people can kind of see other people going to school, they might have friends in that pod, and they can kind of get attracted to, maybe I'll give this a shot because I'm friends with Johnny. Johnny's doing this education thing. I work out with him in the gym, and he seems pretty cool. And they might be exposed to something they hadn't been exposed to before. And then, of course, as you know, your college students, college could be pretty tough. So it's really important to have an environment where you have the support and the encouragement to go to school. I mean, I remember when I was taking calculus courses, I get stuck on a derivatives problem. Who do you ask? You know, I have to write my instructor a letter. I get an answer in 2 weeks. So, you know, it's really tough all by yourself, but if there's an environment with the support, that's really important.
Yeah. Again, I think that's a really important point. We have to foster an environment where that's possible. One of the things I've been thinking about, Dirk, and I wanted to get your reaction to this is, you know, we talked about at the beginning about sort of this weird, if you're in prison, you need to become a plumber or an electrician or whatever. You know, we want you to learn how to do something with your hands, which is like, it's such a strange idea given how difficult those professions actually are. You know, that we assume that there's this large population of people behind bars that are good at those things. I don't know where that assumption originates. But one of the things I've been thinking about is, like, we don't actually know in prison who the Dirks are, who's on this, who's been sitting rewinding that movie and wondering about a different past and a different future. And in order to just identify those people, to like flood the zone of the prison with a whole bunch of different kinds of opportunities, not just vocational, not just bachelor level education, not exclusively anything, but a whole bunch of different things, so that people have a bunch of different hooks that they can grab onto that happen to tap into their interests, as a way, in part, just to identify who's actually thinking about trying to create a different future. What do you think of that idea?
That's interesting. How would you think about structuring that?
Well, I mean, it would take a pretty progressive, I think, prison administration and some investment, but that you would, you know, you'd pick out a facility or two, and you would say, okay, we want a whole bunch of different kinds of opportunities in front of these prisoners, in large part because we want to know which of them are on this desistance journey. So if we've only got 30% of them enrolled in any kind of rehabilitative activity, is that partly a problem of like not having the right stuff in front of them? You know, so we want to do some really great kind of high school completion stuff. That's one thing we want to offer. We want to offer people who did complete high school access to college education, or access to kind of a community college style program, or you know, so in other words, you create all of these different things. You say you choose, not we're directing you, but you choose which of these things you want to do.
Okay, so this is actually a really interesting parallel, because some people have done something kind of like this. So what happened when I was incarcerated is, because I had a lot of time on my hands, I didn't watch that much TV, I would read policy. So I would read policy about the educational programs. And as it turned out, the legislator in Washington State, for example, or California, the people in the, you know, the higher, you know, in the legislature, they're actually writing great policies. Some of the policies would include support for post-secondary education, computer access, computer lab, video, like they have all of these supports. And I'm reading these RCWs, or these Washington Revised Code of Washington laws. I'm like, oh my God, this totally applies to me. How come we don't have this here? So some wise people in the legislature have created these wonderful policies. And then you find out in the prison, you have none of that. And it's like, then you approach the prison people. And this is also what Brent said, if you had a great prison warden or superintendent or administrator. And that's the whole thing, because you have these great policies that are created, but somebody executes the policy, and that goes through the Department of Corrections, then the superintendent or the warden in that specific prison. And even if he's in support of it, then it gets drifted down to the staff. So there has to be some kind of accountability or oversight, because these great policies get watered down to what actually ends up on the floor of the prison is nothing. So when I find these policies, I'm like, oh my God, here's all of these things I should have support for. Nobody wants to support them. Then of course you write the senators, and he's like, hey, you wrote this policy, you wrote this thing that became a law, and it's wonderful. Thank you for doing that. But guess what? We don't get it. You know, so So that starts a conversation that just really never goes anywhere. So you really need buy-in. Like, I think it was Philip Kotler, he wrote some article for Harvard Business Review called "Why Transformation Efforts Fail" or something like that. But the point is, even when you have these great ideas on top, let's like say if the CEO has this great idea, in order for a whole company to change, or in this case, a whole prison system, everyone has to be on board. And it's so freaking difficult to change anything. So like Brent would say, the legislator would have to pass something, it would have to become a law or a pilot program. The warden, the president would have to be on board, and seriously on board, because he would then have to change the culture of the prison, or at least the culture of a part of a prison, to make all this environment happen. And then the guards would have to be on board. And the guards are not your friends when you're going to school. They're trying to, that was a big challenge of mine, getting past the guards. Sometimes they wouldn't let you out of your cell. They would give you bad time for going to school because they thought you should be in prison, not in school. So there's so many different pieces that you have to get aligned for something like that to happen. But if you could, that would.
No, I mean, that's the thing. You can't drop this kind of policy into the entire system at one time. You have to kind of have proof of concept, and you've got to have, you have to have tested it, and you have to have something that's replicable, which is a real challenge.
And you need
okay, a prison. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I said that you would need a prison warden or administrator that's entrepreneurial, but they all tend to be risk averse. So they're not going to say, hey, here's a great idea that I may be ridiculed for, so let's do it.
Right. And there are some interesting things in this vein that are going on. In fact, the state of Pennsylvania's Department of Correction is experimenting with things like this right now. But you're right. You have to build the ethos of this from the ground up. Everybody has to be bought in. The administrators, the guards, and the participants have to be bought into this as a concept. So, okay, we're supposed to start transitioning to audience questions.
Great.
So Audrey, I think, is leading us in this. Audrey, let me just say, Audrey has been working on our team at AEI as an intern for the summer, and now she's continuing into the fall, and she's been an enormous asset to us, and I'm really grateful for her work, and her insights have been really useful, and for setting this up today, helping us to get this set up today too. So anyway, Audrey, what kind of questions do we have out there?
Great. First of all, thank you so much putting me on the spot here. But so we're now opening to Q&A. Everyone, there's a little Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can just go in and type your question there. Oh, wow, we have quite a few. So our first question is, what is the college application like for people with incarceration records after they leave college? So what are their outcomes, and how easy is it for them to enter post-secondary education?
You mean after they get out of prison?
So after they get out of prison.
Yeah. Any experience with that, Dirk?
Yeah, you broke out for a second. Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. Yeah, of course. What is the college application process like for people who were incarcerated and have left prison already? So what are the outcomes and how easy is it?
Okay, that's interesting. And every state and university system is different. You may have heard of the ban the box movement, where they want to remove the box for employment, for housing. That's also for education. And just recently in Washington State, University of Washington actually had the box. And people, questioned the president of the university. They say, hey, why do you have the criminal record question on your application? And she said, well, we don't use it for screening. Well, if you don't use it for screening, why is a box on your application? Because the presence of the box will turn a lot of people away from applying in the first place. They think, well, if I have to answer the question of being a criminal, I'm not going to be able to get in. So some colleges do screen, some have the box. And just recently, one of our Washington State formerly incarcerated people, Tara Simmons, she became the first formerly incarcerated person to become an attorney. There's a huge legal process that went through. She connected with a guy that he was actually a prisoner who's like a legal guy, and he won a Supreme Court case from prison, and he became a professor at Georgetown, and he actually flew out to Georgetown to argue the case of the Washington State Supreme Court because she couldn't get past the moral and ethics test to become an attorney. Anyways, they won, so she's the first precedent of a formerly incarcerated attorney. So there are some challenges at some universities letting formerly incarcerated people in. So it's kind of hit or miss. I don't know if that really answers that process question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what can people who are just normal citizens at home do to help change the current criminal justice system? And that's just for either of you.
I guess you have to be educated. Yeah, knowledge is power. So like a lot of people, they have no idea, how bad the system is. Or, a lot of people when they hear about, 2.2 million people incarcerated, we have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Some people just don't know this. So maybe education is important. They have to figure out what kind of path can be laid out for them to help them make the change, which is either voting or contacting senators, representatives, just taking an interest in their society. Or they could just, if they want to start on a small level, they can volunteer for nonprofits that do these things, make investments there with their time and resources. Find something that really speaks to them and in fact, enact that change in that area.
So Dirk, if someone were interested in helping out with PSF, what would they do?
Oh yeah, please send me an email at Dirk, D-I-R-K, at prisonscholars.org. You can also visit our website, prisonscholars.org, and we have a contact button there. Learn more about what we do, and happy to have some help.
So what kinds of volunteer stuff what kinds of things do you have volunteers do?
Yeah, just yesterday we had a United Way Day of Caring. And of course, with COVID, these are all virtual projects. In this case, we're scanning and uploading letters from people that are currently incarcerated that want to go to school. Now, of course, the Prison Scholar Fund is a pretty small organization, and we're really the only organization in America that does this. And as that means that every prisoner in America that has their father or their brother or their somebody search on the internet for prisoner education, we pop up. So we get thousands of letters from all over the nation about people wanting to go to school. And we don't just throw those letters away. We want to scan them, put them in our Salesforce database, so that if we ever have funding for a certain region or an area, we can maybe help these people. And also it kind of shows the demand. When people think that prisoners don't want to go to school, we have thousands of letters saying otherwise. But that's just one example of a virtual job. We have people here scanning the letters. Once they're in a Google Drive, it becomes a PDF that can be uploaded to the database. We have social media stuff. Right now we're kind of heavily involved with food distribution during COVID. We have work that can be done virtually. So some of the stuff is in the office hands-on, but a lot of the work is virtual. So I like to kind of have a conversation with the potential volunteer and kind of find out where their passions are. So whatever the job they want to do kind of aligns with their interests.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how different are the incentives for offering educational programs in public and private prisons?
I know a little bit about that. Do you want to jump on it, Brent?
No, I don't. I don't know anything about it. I think it's a great question.
Okay, so I'll start with the private prison. That's actually, I did 5 years of my time there, which is actually where the Prison Scholar Fund started. Well, also, I want to respect our time. How are we doing for time? Should I keep these pretty short? Are we off at 3, or how long does this go?
I think if both of you aren't too busy, we can go a little bit long because we do have a few questions, and then we'll break, and then we'll go to the 20-minute, just kind of small group discussion afterwards.
Oh yeah, I'm perfect for time. Okay, so in the private prison, they really don't care what you do. It's kind of like the people that work in a private prison, they either get a job at Walmart or Target, or they'll work in the private prison. So it's really low skilled labor working in a prison. The guards don't care what you do. The administrators don't care what you do because they're just getting paid to house you. So that's actually where the Prison Scholar Fund started, because there was no oversight. I could just do whatever I wanted. In my case, I started a nonprofit. But they also really aren't supportive of anything. They're not trying to help you go to school. And there's really no incentives in the private prison to do anything other than they just leave you alone. And that's kind of a nice incentive. In the States, California, for instance, even though that, the educational access has been taken away, the state is really, really strong. It's probably one of the strongest states in the nation right now of supporting prisoner education. We partner with them because they pay for the associate's degree up to, they pay for the tuition for the associate's degree, but they don't pay for the books. They have e-readers, which are terrible. So we come along, we pay for the books, and then we pay for up to the bachelor's degree for some students. But part of that is California offers incentives insofar as if you get an associate's degree, you get X amount of years knocked off your sentence. A bachelor's degree takes more time off your sentence. So people realize the farther they get in education, the less time they do. And so that's kind of a really great motivator to steer somebody towards education. And I think that the matrix for how many years you get knocked off your sentences for what crimes probably comes into play too. But other states have talked about that. That's the only state that I know that's doing it.
Great, another question. What are your thoughts on the impact of felon employment discrimination on recidivism rates? Are post-sentence employment barriers more or less damaging to rehabilitation than a lack of educational opportunities in prison?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because that's really just kind of pragmatic. It's like if you're convicted of financial crimes, you're probably not getting a job at a bank. So you really have to kind of figure out, where can you take your education where it's applicable? And of course, some industries aren't going to want you at all. So you really got to figure out where you fit. But some industries are really interesting. So I did a Google Lunch and Learn in Mountain View a couple of years ago, and just before my speech was the equity inclusion woman was giving her thing. So when she heard about what we were doing, she got really excited. And when I talked to Google, she's like, "Oh yeah, we've banned the box at Google." Sounds great, right? But the real question is, even though you've banned the box, how many formerly incarcerated people are you hiring? Because they're Google, they don't need to ask the question; that they could just figure it out. But the question is, even though that question isn't on the application, is there a job path or career path for a formerly incarcerated person? And they don't really share that data, and I can't figure that out. So it's a reality. It's like even when the employer bans the box, they can still not hire you if that criminal record has something to do with an actual business decision that's valid. Like you don't want a sex offender working in a daycare, you don't want a bank robber working in a bank. So yeah, it's not going to be easy, but you want to align your educational journey with what you could actually do.
We have one quick question and then another one. Can you repeat your email for volunteer opportunities with the Prison Scholar Fund?
Sure, it's Dirk, D-I-R-K. I'll spell that, so that'd be Delta, Idaho, Romeo, Kilo, at prisonscholars.org. That's Prison scholars.org. Maybe we could have like a little PowerPoint flash or something, if anybody misses that. Or you could just Google Dirk Van Velzen. I think I'd pop up.
Maybe Gil, why don't you type that into the chat, the actual email address, so that people can have that.
I think I can type it too. Can't
Okay.
I? There we go.
I don't know who gets to chat.
And then we might do maybe two more questions. This is a really interesting one and very pertinent right now. What has been COVID's impact on those in prison as of right now?
So I can talk a little bit about that from kind of a macro perspective. We know that prisons around the country have been real hot spots for COVID infections, which isn't in any way surprising. Anytime you have a lot of people in one place, you're going to have a lot of spread of the disease. And so we've seen about 42,000 reported infections. Is probably, that may be a fraction of what's actually happened, but that's what's been reported, about 42,000 among prisoners. There's been more among prison staff. There's been infections from prisons into communities as people travel in and out of the prison who work there. We've had about 200 deaths as of this week. I think there had been 203 deaths of people in prison who've died of COVID. And it's really one of these you know, I wrote a piece this week on the Bulwark, which we can post if anybody's interested in reading about this. But there are a series of kind of invisible populations that are really bearing the brunt of the COVID crisis. Immigrants, people working in food processing, the elderly, and of course, you know, prisoners are among those. They're just invisible to the broader society, and so part of this phenomenon that we're experiencing is that COVID is somebody else's problem, and that's a real tragedy for the country and for the people who have been so heavily impacted. And you've had some experience in trying to cope with this as well, right?
Yeah, so just in the little chat, I put the link for our blog. So we have a bunch of our currently incarcerated prison scholars that blog about, some of their blogs actually about COVID and their experiences with COVID on the inside. I haven't had any COVID myself, because I've been out for a few years, but as running a nonprofit, we've kind of had to pivot because during the COVID experience, we're helping people with food resources as opposed to strictly just education. So we kind of pivoted on how we can support formerly incarcerated people. If you can't eat, you can't live. So that's kind of one of the first things we try to help people with, and then job placement and education. But yeah, there's quite a few different stories about people's individual experiences with COVID.
And we're going to be, Audrey and I and others on our team, we're going to be working with Dirk to try to capture some of the stories that are happening in prison as, you know, relating to COVID, because it's really important that those stories not get lost, that they get heard somehow, that this has been a matter of great suffering for a lot of people behind bars. So that's a good question and something we really want to focus on.
Great. Thank you all for your questions. They were all excellent. I'm putting the Zoom link for the 20-minute small group discussion after this event into the chat right now, and you can click on it. This is a webinar format, obviously, but the Zoom link that we'll be going into is more of a discussion format, so we can, casually ask our questions and converse about any other topics you would like to. All right. So for those of you who are interested, you can just click on that now, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Yeah, great. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Dirk. Gil, I believe you'll be joining us on the next Zoom call. But yes, thank you all for coming. Great.
Thanks for having me.
For having
Thanks
us.
so much.
Yep.
All right.